The moment Mabel Ford rode into the dying town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, because a woman traveling alone with a Winchester rifle across her saddle and 4 territories of dust on her coat was not something any of them had seen before. She did not slow her bay mare for any of them. She rode straight down the center of the street, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, her jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that comes not from arrogance, but from having already survived everything that was supposed to stop her. The mare's hooves rang against the packed dirt, and the sound of them was the only sound Mabel chose to acknowledge. She had ridden out of Texas first, then through Indian Territory, then across the southeastern corner of Colorado, and then into Kansas, and in every one of those territories she had been told some version of the same thing. "Go home, woman. This is not your fight. You will not find what you are looking for. A woman like you has no business chasing a man like Harlan Cross." She had listened to all of it with the same expression she wore now, the one that said she had heard every word and intended to do exactly as she pleased regardless. The debt she carried was not money, though there was money involved. The debt was the kind that gets written in blood and grief, the kind that does not dissolve with time but instead calcifies somewhere behind the ribs and sits there, heavier every morning, until you either do something about it or let it hollow you out entirely. Harlan Cross had taken everything from her family, her father's land, her mother's peace of mind. And finally, 3 years ago, her father himself, run off his own property at gunpoint by Cross's hired men, dead of a broken heart in a rented room in San Antonio before the month was out. Mabel had buried her father with what little money remained in his coat pocket and ridden north the same afternoon. That was 3 years ago and 4 territories ago, and now she was in Caldwell, Kansas, where the last reliable word she had received told her Harlan Cross was running a cattle operation just north of town with a foreman named Deke Pullman, and a habit of bribing local officials to look the other way. She pulled the mare up in front of the livery stable and dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who had spent more hours in the saddle this year than out of it. The hostler, a wiry old man with a tobacco-stained beard, came out to meet her. "Boarding for the night," she said. "Her name is Sunday. She gets oats and fresh water, and if I come back to find she's been shorted on either, we will have a conversation neither of us wants to have." The old man looked at the Winchester and then at Mabel's face and nodded without argument. She paid him from a small leather purse that was considerably lighter than it had been when she left Texas, took her saddlebags over her shoulder, and walked down the street toward the only hotel that appeared to still be in operation. Caldwell had seen better days. The cattle trade had moved further west and the town had a faded, hollowed-out quality, like a photograph left too long in the sun. But there were still people here and there were still businesses and there was, according to the bartender in the last town she had passed through, a man named Simon Bancroft who served as the county deputy, and who was, by all accounts, one of the few honest men left in the whole of Sumner County. She had not come to Caldwell for Simon Bancroft, but she had learned over 4 territories in 3 years that an honest man in a position of some authority was not a thing to waste. The hotel lobby was dim and smelled of pipe smoke and lye soap. A woman behind the desk looked up when Mabel entered and did not quite manage to hide her surprise. "Room, please," Mabel said. "Single." "How long is your hot water available in the evenings?" "Until about 7, usually," the woman said, recovering herself. $1.50 for the room and we serve supper at 6. "I will take it." She signed the register as Mabel Ford, which was her name and which she had stopped hiding somewhere in the 2nd Territory, having decided that if Harlan Cross knew she was coming then at least he would have the decency to feel some fear. She went upstairs, washed the road off her face and hands in the basin, changed her shirt, reloaded the Winchester out of habit, and then sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let herself feel, for just a moment, how tired she was. Not the tired that sleep fixes, the other kind. The tired that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long without anyone to help you carry it. She allowed herself 30 seconds of it, which was her custom, and then she stood up and went back downstairs and out into the evening to find the sheriff's office and the man named Simon Bancroft. She found it 2 blocks from the hotel, a low adobe building with a lantern burning in the window. Through the glass she could see a man sitting at a desk, reading something with his chin propped on one fist, a coffee cup at his elbow. He was perhaps 30, 32, with dark brown hair that needed a cut and the kind of shoulders that came from actual physical work rather than show. He wore a deputy's badge on a wool vest, and his feet, she noticed, were crossed on the corner of the desk in a way that suggested he was comfortable but not lazy, that he had simply decided to be at ease for a moment and could stop being at ease at any given second. She pushed open the door. He looked up from his reading, and his feet came off the desk in a single smooth motion that was entirely unconscious, the automatic response of a man who had been raised to show basic courtesy. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Mabel said. "You are Deputy Bancroft." "I am. My name is Mabel Ford. I have ridden across 4 territories to have a conversation with Harlan Cross, and I would like to know whether you are going to help me or get in my way." There was a pause. He set down whatever he had been reading, which appeared to be a land survey report of some kind, and leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the kind of careful attention that was not impolite but was thoroughly assessing. "That is a direct way to introduce yourself," he said. "I have found that directness saves time," Mabel said. "I have spent 3 years being indirect, and it has not served me particularly well." "Sit down, Miss Ford," he said, and pushed a chair toward her with his boot. "Tell me about Harlan Cross." She sat. She told him. She told it the way she always told it when she trusted the person she was telling, which was thoroughly and without editorializing, because the facts themselves were damning enough without embellishment. She told him about her father's land outside of Laredo, 240 acres of good grazing land that had been in the Ford family since her grandfather drove a stake in the ground in 1849. She told him how Cross had arrived in 1877 with money from somewhere back east and a lawyer, and a set of documents that her father's lawyer later said had the look of forgeries but could never quite prove it. She told him about the harassment, the fence cutting, the water diversion, the 2 hired hands her father fired who showed up 2 weeks later working for Cross and causing trouble. She told him about the final eviction, conducted at gunpoint by men whose faces she had memorized, and about her father's death in San Antonio, and about the 3 years she had spent tracking Cross from Texas to Indian Territory to Colorado to Kansas, gathering evidence at every stop, talking to every man and woman who had crossed paths with him and come away the worse for it. Simon Bancroft listened to all of it without interrupting once, which was itself remarkable in her experience. He kept his eyes on her face, and he did not look skeptical, and he did not look patronizing, and he did not once suggest that perhaps she ought to let the proper authorities handle it, which was what every other official she had approached had said before explaining that their hands were tied or their budget was insufficient or that Cross was a complicated situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much of this can you document?" he said. "Most of it," she said. "I have affidavits from 11 individuals in 4 territories. I have the original deed to my father's property in Laredo, which predates anything Cross filed by 27 years. I have a letter from a land agent in Colorado who saw Cross use the same legal maneuver there that he used in Texas. I have a sworn statement from a deputy in Indian Territory who witnessed Cross's man Deke Pullman intimidate a witness in a property dispute." She reached into her saddlebag and produced a thick envelope sealed with wax. "It is all in here." He took the envelope and held it with both hands, feeling the weight of it. "You put this together yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "My father taught me to read and cipher," she said, "and I have had 3 years and considerable motivation." Something moved across his face that she could not quite name. It was not pity, which she would have resented. It was something closer to recognition, or perhaps to the particular admiration that one person feels for another who has done a hard thing without complaint. "The cross operation north of town," he said. "I have had suspicions about it for 6 months. The county sheriff, man named Alton Burke, he has been difficult about pursuing it. Cross has money and Burke has expensive tastes for a man on a sheriff's salary." "I see," Mabel said. "The federal land office in Wichita is a different matter," he said. "They have jurisdiction over land fraud that crosses territorial lines. If what you have here is as solid as you say it is, this is a federal case, not a county case. Burke cannot touch it." It was the first time in 3 years that anyone in any official capacity had said anything to her that sounded like forward motion rather than a closed door. She felt something loosen in her chest, a small increment, the way a knot shifts when you finally pull the right end. "How far is Wichita?" she said. "About 60 miles northeast," he said. 2 days easy ride. 1 long day if you push it." "Then that is where I need to go," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the envelope in his hands and then back up at her. "Miss Ford," he said, "what you have here is substantial. But you have been doing this alone for 3 years, and the last stretch, Wichita and the federal office, that one has some complications you may not be aware of. Cross has a man in Wichita too. Not the federal office, but he has connections in the town, people who watch for trouble coming his direction. If you ride in there alone with this envelope, there is a chance it gets intercepted before it reaches the right hands." "I have managed 4 territories," she said, with a touch of sharpness. "I know you have," he said, and there was nothing diminishing in his tone, only straightforwardness. "I am not suggesting you cannot manage. I am suggesting that 2 people are harder to intercept than 1, and that I know the federal land agent in Wichita personally, a man named Garrett Hayes, and that if I ride with you and deliver this directly to Garrett's hands, the chance of it disappearing along the way drops considerably." Mabel looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching and without pretense, and she had spent 3 years developing an accurate sense of when a man was offering help because he genuinely meant it, and when he was offering help because he wanted something from her or because he thought she needed rescuing. This was neither of those things. This was a man who had looked at a problem and identified the most efficient solution and was proposing it with the same matter-of-fact practicality she might have applied herself. "You would ride to Wichita," she said, "with me. You have ridden across 4 territories," he said. "I would ride the 5th with you." She looked at him for another long moment, measuring. Then she gave a single nod. "We leave at first light," she said. "First light it is," he said. She stood to go, and he stood as well because that was his manner, and as she turned toward the door he said, "Miss Ford, have you eaten this evening?" She had not. She had been running on a biscuit she had in her saddlebag since midday, and the question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because she had gotten so thoroughly into the habit of not being asked by anyone that she had almost forgotten to notice hunger. "Not yet," she said. "There is a decent place 2 doors down from the hotel," he said. "Mrs. Chackin runs it. Good food, and she does not charge extra for traveling women, which some places around here do." It was such a specific and observant thing to say, that some places charged women extra, that it surprised her into looking at him again. He said it without irony, just as a piece of practical information offered in good faith. "Thank you," she said. "Good night, Miss Ford." "Good night, Deputy." She went to Mrs. Chackin's and had beef stew and fresh cornbread and coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she sat at a corner table and thought about the deputy with the wolf-quiet eyes and the straightforward mouth and the long hands that had held her 3-year envelope as though it were something worth being careful with. She went back to the hotel and slept better than she had in weeks, and she did not entirely know why. She was in the livery before dawn, saddling Sunday by lantern light, when she heard boots on the packed dirt outside, and Simon Bancroft appeared in the doorway with 2 horses in tow, his own dark roan and a spare, and a canvas-wrapped bundle over one shoulder that turned out to be food for the road, biscuits and salt pork and dried apples, put together with someone's care. "You did not have to do that," she said, meaning the food. "Road to Wichita runs through empty country for the first 20 miles, he said, tying his roan at the post. "Better to have it." They rode out in the gray pre-dawn, the prairie stretching flat and enormous in every direction, the sky enormous above it, and the air carrying the particular freshness of early morning on the Kansas plain that Mabel had come to love despite herself, that clean, wide smell of grass and sky that no city anywhere had ever quite replicated. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, which suited Mabel fine and appeared to suit Simon equally well. He was not a man who talked to fill space, which she noted with appreciation. He rode well, with the easy, settled posture of someone who had grown up on horseback, and he kept pace with her without crowding, and did not offer to take the Winchester or the saddlebags or any of the things she was carrying perfectly well on her own. When the sun was fully up and the prairie was beginning to warm, they stopped at a shallow creek to water the horses, and Simon unwrapped the biscuits and salt pork and they ate standing, because neither of them was in the habit of dawdling. "How did you get into this work?" she asked, meaning the deputy position, and she surprised herself slightly by asking because she did not usually ask things she was not prepared to hear the answer to, and she found she was genuinely curious about him in a way that was separate from whether he was going to be useful. He considered the question with the same unhurried attention he appeared to apply to everything. "My father was a lawman in Missouri," he said, "before the war made that complicated. After the war I came west. Tried ranching for a while, but I am better at the other thing." He paused. "What made you decide to pursue this yourself rather than find a lawyer?" "I had a lawyer," she said, "in the beginning. He was a decent man and he tried. But Cross had better lawyers and more money, and the local courts were not interested in ruling against a man who was bringing capital into the region." She broke off a piece of biscuit. "After the first 2 years of watching the legal process amount to nothing, I decided that what was needed was evidence sufficient to take it above the local level, which is what I have spent 3 years building." "Smart," he said, and he said it the way people say something that is simply true rather than something designed to flatter. "I had to be," she said. They rode on. The prairie rolled gently under the horses' feet, and the sky was enormous and blue and full of meadowlarks. And somewhere in the middle of the morning, without either of them consciously deciding that the silence had shifted into something else, they began to talk in the way that people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's minds and have enough road ahead that there is no particular pressure to hurry. She learned that he had grown up in a small town in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, and that his mother had been a schoolteacher who believed with religious fervor that every person, regardless of circumstance, deserved to be able to read, and that this belief had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. He told her about coming to Kansas in 1876, about the cattle drives he had worked for 2 seasons, about the moment he had decided that the law was a better fit for his particular nature than ranching, not because he minded hard physical work, but because his mind ran toward order and fairness in a way that the cattle trade did not particularly reward. She told him about her childhood on the Laredo property, about her father teaching her to ride and shoot and track before most girls her age had done anything more adventurous than attend a church social. Her mother had died when Mabel was 12, a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, taking everything with it. And after that it had been her and her father alone on those 240 acres, and they had managed it together with the particular fierce competence of 2 people who cannot afford to fail. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Simon said. "He was," she said, and her voice was, even because she had made peace with most of the grief by now, had transmuted it into the forward motion that had brought her 4 territories north. But there was always a note in her voice when she talked about her father, something underneath the evenness that she could not quite iron flat, and she was aware that Simon heard it because his eyes moved to her face for a moment with an expression that was entirely kind. They made good progress through the day, stopping twice more to water the horses and once to let Sunday rest her foreleg, which had been slightly off since the day before, nothing serious but worth attending to. Simon dismounted and examined the hoof with quiet competence and found a small stone lodged near the frog and worked it out with his knife, and Mabel watched him do it with the calm, careful attention of a man who genuinely cared about horses, not just as tools but as living things, and she noted it. By late afternoon they were within 20 miles of Wichita, and the landscape was beginning to show signs of more settled country, fence lines here and there, the distant shapes of farmsteads, the occasional wagon track crossing their path. "I want to explain something about Garrett Hayes before we arrive," Simon said as they rode. "Please do," she said. "He is a thorough man and an honest one," Simon said, "but he is also a careful man, and he will want time to review what you have brought before he commits to anything. Do not be discouraged if he does not immediately say what you want to hear. He is not the type who makes promises before he is certain he can keep them." "I respect that," Mabel said. "I thought you might," he said. They camped that night on the edge of a small creek perhaps 12 miles out of Wichita, because the horses needed rest, and because pushing on in the dark through country that was unfamiliar to either of them with a valuable envelope in Mabel's saddlebag did not seem wise. Simon built a small, clean fire, and she made coffee from the grounds in her saddlebag, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire with their tin cups and the sound of the horses cropping grass nearby and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "In all of this," he said, 3 years, 4 territories, the evidence, the tracking, the planning, have you ever been afraid?" She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to do. "Yes," she said. "Plenty of times. Fear is useful information. It tells you when something is genuinely dangerous. I have been afraid when I needed to be, and I have acted anyway because the alternative was abandoning something I could not abandon in good conscience." She looked at the fire. "My father worked that land for 20 years. His father worked it before that. The debt is real. You do not walk away from a real debt because you are afraid." Simon was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose you do not." The fire crackled softly between them, and she looked across it at his face, lit in orange and shadow, and she thought that he was a genuinely good-looking man in the way that had nothing to do with vanity, the kind of good-looking that came from a face that was honest and a jaw that was strong and eyes that looked at you as though what you were saying was the most interesting thing in the room. She had not thought about any man's face with any particular feeling in 3 years, and she noticed the thought now with a kind of careful alertness, the way you notice the first sign of weather changing. She put her coffee cup down and said good night and rolled in her blanket on the far side of the fire and went to sleep, and she did not let herself think about it any further than that, not yet. Morning came cool and gray, and she was up before him, which she had not expected, and she had the horses fed and the fire stoked and fresh coffee on before he opened his eyes, and when he sat up and saw what she had done he smiled, a real one, the kind that reached his eyes and had nothing performed about it. "You did not have to do that," he said, and she recognized her own words from the previous day coming back at her, and she smiled too, unexpectedly, for the first time in what felt like a long while. "Better to have it," she said, echoing his own logic, and he laughed, a short, warm sound that did something entirely inconvenient to her equilibrium. They broke camp and were riding by the time the sun was fully up, and they rode into Wichita 2 hours later, the town spreading before them in the morning light, bigger and louder and more complicated than Caldwell, the streets already moving with wagons and foot traffic, and the noise of a place that had not yet decided whether it was going to remain a cattle town or become something else entirely. The Federal Land Office was on Douglas Avenue, A solid brick building with a painted sign that looked more permanent than anything Mabel had walked into in 4 territories. And that permanence felt like something, though she could not quite have said what. Garrett Hayes was a lean man in his mid-40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful hands of someone who spent most of his life handling documents. He greeted Simon with the ease of genuine acquaintance and looked at Mabel with polite curiosity that shifted quickly to attention when Simon explained briefly who she was and what she had brought. "Miss Ford," Hayes said, "please sit down and tell me everything." She told it again, the whole of it, and this time she was telling it to a man who kept a notepad and asked precise questions at precise intervals. The kind of questions that told her he already understood the legal framework she was working within and was probing for the places where her evidence was strongest. She answered every question directly, and when Hayes reached across the desk for the envelope, she gave it to him and watched him open it with the careful precision of a man who understood the value of what he was handling. He read in silence for a long time. Simon sat beside Mabel and did not speak, and neither did she, and the office clock ticked, and through the window Wichita went about its business. "Miss Ford," Hayes said finally, setting the last page down with a steadiness that she chose to read as a good sign, "this is extraordinary documentation for a case of this kind. The affidavits are properly witnessed, the deed is clear, and the cross-territorial nature of the fraud puts it squarely within federal jurisdiction." He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth in a way that seemed to be a habitual organizing gesture. "I want to be transparent with you about the timeline. A case of this complexity will require several weeks to formally investigate and file. We will need to serve cross-formally, and there will be a legal process." "I understand that," she said. "I have been patient for 3 years. Several weeks is not a difficulty. What I can tell you today," he said, "is that on the basis of what you have presented, I am prepared to file for a federal hold on all of Cross's land transactions while the investigation proceeds. That means he cannot sell, transfer, or further encumber any of the properties in question, including the one in Laredo. It freezes the situation until it is resolved." Mabel had not allowed herself to imagine victory, not in any specific way, because she had learned that specific imaginings led to specific disappointments. But she had imagined something like this moment, the moment when the weight of 3 years began, just slightly, to shift. She felt the shift now, that incremental loosening, more pronounced than the night before, more real. "That is what I needed to hear," she said, and her voice was steady and controlled, but her hands were clasped very tightly in her lap, and she was aware of it. "I will need you to remain in Wichita for a few days while we begin the formal process," Hayes said. "There will be additional questions, and we will need your sworn deposition for the file." "I will stay as long as necessary," she said. Hayes looked at Simon. "I assume you can vouch for Miss Ford's presence in Sumner County, Simon." "Without reservation," Simon said. After they left the land office, they stood on the street in the morning sun, and Mabel looked up at the sky for a moment with her eyes closed and breathed, and Simon stood beside her and did not say anything because he appeared to understand that this was not a moment that needed words. When she opened her eyes, she said, "Thank you. You did the work," he said. "I just knew where to take it." "That mattered," she said. "It mattered a great deal." He nodded and then said, "We should find rooms. There is a decent hotel on Kisham Street that is not too expensive, and then I think you should eat a real meal in a real establishment because you have been running on biscuits and coffee and determination for several days, and all 3 of those things have limits." She laughed. It came out differently than she expected, lighter than she was used to feeling, and she pressed her fingers briefly to her lips as if surprised by it. "All right," she said, "a real meal." They stayed in Wichita for 5 days. The depositions took 2 of those days, long, careful sessions in the land office with Hayes and his clerk, working through every piece of evidence, every affidavit, every date and name and transaction in Mabel's 3-year record. It was thorough and sometimes exhausting, and she was grateful for it because thoroughness was what this needed. The other 3 days had a quality she had not expected, a slowness and an ease that had nothing to do with inactivity. Simon knew Wichita reasonably well from previous visits, and he showed her the parts worth showing. The good restaurant on Market Street, where the proprietor had come from New Orleans and cooked accordingly. The bookshop on Douglas Avenue, where she spent an entire afternoon that surprised her by being entirely pleasurable. The evening market where farmers from the surrounding country came to sell produce, and where the smells of fresh bread and late-season apples were enough to make even a woman on a 3-year mission stop and breathe them in. He bought her an apple from a farm woman who had a bushel of them in a wooden crate, handing it to her with the casual naturalness of someone who had not overthought the gesture. And she took it and ate it walking down the street beside him, and the simplicity of it, the uncomplicated goodness of a fresh apple, and a mild evening, and a man who walked beside her as an equal rather than an obstacle or a project, struck her somewhere deep and quiet. They talked through every evening, at dinner or walking or sitting on the hotel veranda with coffee, and the talking had the quality of two people who had been looking at the same landscape from different angles and were discovering, with increasing interest, how much their views overlapped. He told her about the land in Kansas, what it was like in the early seasons before the settlers came in such numbers, when the grass was unbroken, and the sky was enormous in a way that made you feel both small and free simultaneously. She told him about the way the Texas Hill Country looked in early spring when the wildflowers came up, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush covering the hillsides like a quilt, and her father taking her out on horseback to see it every year as though it were something that might not come back if you did not pay proper attention to it. "He sounds like he loved it," Simon said. "More than anything except me," she said. And even that was close. On the fourth evening, sitting on the veranda as the last light faded over the prairie, he said something that she had been half expecting and half dreading and half hoping for, and the fact that she had not been able to settle on one of those 3 options told her something. "What do you do," he said carefully, "after this is finished, after the case is resolved and Cross is dealt with and the debt is settled? What happens then?" She had been asked this before, by well-meaning people in various territories, and she had always answered in the same way, that she would think about afterward when afterward arrived, that she had not permitted herself to plan for it because planning for it required a confidence in the outcome that she had been afraid to feel. But sitting here with Simon Bancroft, with Hayes's solid brick office and the federal hold on Cross's transactions and the weight of the saddlebag considerably lighter against her chair, she found that the question had a different texture to it than it had ever had before. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "The land in Laredo, it is still legally in question. If the case goes the way Hayes thinks it will, there may be restitution, a financial settlement for what was taken. It would not be the same as having the land back, but it would be something." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been moving for 3 years. I am not sure I know how to stop." "That is a real thing," he said. "Motion becomes its own habit." "What about you?" she asked. "What about me?" "You have a life in Caldwell. You have left it to come to Wichita for nearly a week." "Caldwell will manage," he said. He looked out at the street where the evening traffic was thinning, a wagon here, a rider there. "I have been in Caldwell for 2 years. It is a good enough town." "It is not precisely where I intended to remain permanently." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, which she suspected was deliberate, giving her the space to receive what he was saying without the pressure of direct attention. "Simon," she said. He looked at her then. "I am not in the habit of this," she said. "I am not practiced at it. 3 years of single-minded focus does not leave a person well practiced in personal matters." "I know," he said. "Neither am I particularly practiced. I have been a deputy in a fading Kansas town for 2 years, and before that I was working cattle drives, which are not a circumstance that encourages the development of social graces." She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light, at the honest open face and the careful eyes, and the way he sat with his elbows on the railing and looked at her as though she was something worth looking at, not in the way that made her feel observed, but in the way that made her feel seen, which was an entirely different thing. "When this is over," she said, "I think I would like to know what comes next, with some company." He looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was not triumph or satisfaction, but something quieter and more real, a kind of careful gladness. "I think I would like that too," he said. They did not touch that evening. They did not need to. The thing between them had been named, gently and without pretense, and that was sufficient for now, for two people who were both, in their own ways, still learning how to stay still. The fifth day brought a development that tightened everything back up. Hayes called them both into his office that morning with a look on his face that was controlled but pointed. "I received a telegram last night from my counterpart in Denver," Hayes said. "Cross has apparently been made aware that a federal investigation has been initiated. We are not certain how he found out, but the man has ears in several places. His attorney has filed a preliminary motion in the territorial court in Kansas City attempting to preemptively challenge federal jurisdiction." Mabel's jaw tightened. "He is trying to keep it in local courts. He is trying to keep it in courts where he has influence," Hayes said. "Yes. It is a standard delay tactic, and it will not ultimately succeed because the cross-territorial element of the fraud gives us clear federal standing. But it means the timeline extends, and it means there will be more legal maneuvering before we reach resolution." "What does that mean for my deposition?" she said. "Your deposition is filed and secure regardless of what Cross's attorney does," Hayes said. "That is not in jeopardy, but I want you to understand that resolution, meaning the actual legal outcome, could take months rather than weeks. The federal hold on his transaction stands while this proceeds, but the full case may not conclude until later in the year." Mabel sat with this information for a moment. Months. She had spent 3 years on this. Months was not an impossible thing. But it meant that the afterward she had barely begun to consider was further out than she had allowed herself to imagine. "Is there anything that accelerates it?" Simon said, and she noticed that he had said anything rather than anything you need from her, because he was not thinking of her as the instrument of the case but as the person sitting next to him in an office hearing complicated news. "If Cross makes a mistake," Hayes said, "if he attempts to transfer or conceal any of the properties in violation of the federal hold, that constitutes contempt and gives us grounds to escalate significantly. We will be watching." He folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Ford, you have done everything right. The case is solid. The process is simply slower than the crime." "The process is always slower than the crime," she said, and Hayes looked at her with something like rueful agreement. They left the land office and walked out into the Wichita morning, and Simon said nothing for a block and then said, "Where would you like to go?" She thought about it. "I think," she said, "that I would like to ride out of town onto the open prairie for a while. I think better when I am moving." "Then we ride," he said. They saddled their horses and rode east of town, out past the last fence lines and into the open grassland that stretched without interruption under the enormous Kansas sky. And they rode hard for the first 20 minutes, pushing the horses into a real gallop. And the wind and the speed and the sheer physical fact of motion did what it always did for her: cleared something, opened something, allowed her to settle back into her own skin after the tightening that bad news always brought. When they pulled the horses back to a walk, both animals breathing heavily and pleased with themselves, she said, "I am going back to Caldwell with you. I cannot stay in Wichita for months waiting. I need to be doing something." "You could help Hayes with the case," Simon said. "I could," she said, "and I will come back when he needs me, but I am not a patient person by nature, and I will go mad sitting in a hotel room." "Caldwell is not exactly a cosmopolitan destination," he said. "Caldwell has work," she said. "I have some money left, but not much. I rode through 4 territories on what was left of my father's savings and my own earnings from odd work along the way. I am a reasonably good cook, and I can handle livestock, and I can do accounts if someone needs them done. Caldwell has a school, I assume. It does, he said. Does it have a teacher? He looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. At the moment, no. The previous teacher left in February to get married in St. Louis. I have a decent education, she said. My mother was a school teacher. I watched her work for 12 years before she died, and I helped her for the last 2 of those. She looked at him. I can teach school in Caldwell while I wait for Hayes to resolve the case. It gives me purpose and income, and I am not sitting idle. He was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, not the quick one but the real one, the one that reached his eyes. I will introduce you to the school board chairman when we get back, he said. I would appreciate that, she said. They rode back to Wichita at a leisurely pace, side by side, and at some point between the open prairie and the edge of town, her horse drifted slightly, and his drifted slightly, and they were close enough that their boots nearly touched in the stirrups, and neither of them moved away. They were back in Caldwell 3 days later, riding in through the same main street she had ridden into alone barely a week before. And everything was the same and nothing was the same because she was not alone now, and the weight she was carrying, though it had not been set down yet, had been arranged differently, redistributed, and that made an enormous difference to how it sat. The school board chairman was a round, serious man named Douglas Whitfield, who wore his importance like a suit jacket that was slightly too small for him. He interviewed Mabel at the town hall with the slightly bewildered air of a man who had not expected a candidate to arrive quite so directly or quite so immediately, but who was also very much in need of a teacher, and who was therefore willing to overlook the irregular circumstances of her appearance. She answered his questions about her educational background clearly and completely, including the fact that her mother had taught the one-room school outside Laredo, and that she had served as her mother's assistant for 2 years, that she could teach reading and arithmetic and basic geography and history to children from the age of 6 through 12, and that she was available to begin the following Monday. Whitfield hired her, grudgingly but genuinely, and she shook his hand with a firm grip that made him blink, and then she walked out of the town hall into the autumn sunshine of Caldwell, Kansas, and felt something she had not felt in 3 years. A small, solid, ordinary sense of purpose that was not driven entirely by grief and justice, but by something simpler, the immediate prospect of useful daily work. She rented a room from a widow named Mrs. Alvarez, whose house was 3 blocks from the school, and who charged reasonable rates, and who fed her boarders breakfast and supper, and did not ask intrusive questions, which Mabel judged to be an excellent combination. The school was 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14, ranging from children who could read well to children who had never held a book, and the first week was the hardest because she was learning them and they were learning her, and neither party was entirely certain yet what to make of the other. But by the second week, something had settled. She discovered that she had, without having consciously cultivated it, inherited a version of her mother's gift, the ability to make learning feel less like obligation and more like the satisfaction of a puzzle that has a solution. She was not theatrical about it. She simply made the material present and alive and allowed the children to find their way into it. And they did, gradually, with the particular quiet enthusiasm of children who have found something interesting in a place they had not expected to. Simon came to supper at Mrs. Alvarez's table 3 evenings a week, invited by Mrs. Alvarez herself, who appeared to have identified the situation with the efficient perception of a woman who had been observing human nature for 60-something years, and who took a decided interest in seeing it resolved favorably. He brought things, small things, in the way that people bring things when they want to be useful, and also when they are discovering that they would like reasons to appear. A handful of late-harvest apples from the market, a book she had mentioned wanting to read, ordered from the general store, a newspaper from Wichita when he made a supply run, because Hayes sometimes published legal notices that she wanted to follow. She noticed the pattern of it and she let it continue, and she began to bring things too, small things of her own, a slice of Mrs. Alvarez's pie left aside, a cup of coffee ready when he arrived at the school's tiny anteroom to walk her home, a piece of information she had read that she thought would interest him. They walked in the evenings, after supper, in the way that people walk when walking is not really the point and both of them know it, and neither of them says so. Down the main street in the mild autumn air, past the livery where Sunday stood in her stall eating oats and regarding the world with equine placidity, past the hotel, past the small church that was doing double duty as a community hall on weekdays, past the edge of town where the prairie started and the grass moved in the evening wind. He told her one evening, walking out near the edge of town with the sunset turning the sky extraordinary colors over the flat horizon, about his younger brother James who had died in the war, one of the Missouri skirmishes in 1863, 19 years old and dead before he had done anything except be 19 and brave in the wrong place. He told it quietly and without drama, the way people tell the things that have been settled into permanence inside them, and she listened the way she wished people had listened to her, entirely and without the impulse to fix it. He would have liked this, Simon said, meaning the West, the openness of it. Tell me something he would have liked specifically, she said, because she had found that the specifics were what kept people present in a way that general statements could not. He thought about it. He loved horses, he said, not just riding them but the animals themselves. He could identify a horse's mood from 20 yards. He would have loved the cattle country. He paused. He would have had a great deal of opinions about this territory that we would have argued about pleasurably. That sounds like a younger brother, she said. It does, he said, and he smiled in the way you smile at something that is both happy and sad simultaneously. She took his hand. She did it without planning it, simply reaching out as they walked and closing her fingers around his, and she felt him still for a half-second, just a breath of surprise. And then his hand closed around hers and they walked on like that in the wide prairie evening, and she thought that this simple and uncomplicated human warmth was something she had not let herself miss while she was busy surviving, and she was missing it now, and the missing of it felt like a good thing, like something coming back to life. November brought cold and the particular beauty of a Kansas autumn, the grass going gold and rust, the sky a hard clear blue that looked painted, frost on the schoolhouse window some mornings. Mabel wore her good wool coat and taught the children the capitals of the eastern states and long division, and the names of the major rivers, and she found, to her continuing surprise, that she was enjoying it, genuinely and not just functionally. The children were becoming distinct to her, in the way that children become distinct when you pay them proper attention. Each of them, a particular kind of intelligence working in a particular kind of way. There was a girl named Rosa, 10 years old, whose mother had come from Mexico and who was the sharpest reader in the class, and who had been told somewhere along the way that being smart was something to be modest about. And Mabel made a project of quietly and consistently demonstrating that this was incorrect. There was a boy named Eli whose father worked the grain merchants and who had a genuine gift for numbers that was going untended, and she began to give him more complex problems that he solved with a focused pleasure that was lovely to see. She wrote to Hayes once a week, and he wrote back with careful legal updates. Cross's preliminary motion had been denied in December, as Hayes had predicted it would be. The federal investigation was proceeding. There were 2 additional witnesses in the Colorado Territory who had come forward after word spread that a federal case was in motion, people who had been afraid to speak when Cross was unchallenged, but who were willing to speak now that someone with real authority was asking. The case was building. Cross himself, she learned from Hayes's letters, was becoming increasingly aware that the situation was serious. He had replaced his original attorney with a more expensive one from Kansas City, and was attempting to sell off some of his smaller holdings, moves that the federal hold was successfully blocking. She read Hayes's letter one December morning sitting at the schoolroom desk before the children arrived, and when she folded it, she sat quietly for a moment and felt the particular satisfaction of something long in motion, finally beginning to find its conclusion. Simon knocked at the schoolroom door at noon, which he sometimes did when his morning rounds brought him close by, bringing a covered pail of soup from Mrs. Chackin's. "Good letter," he said, reading her expression. "Good letter," she said. "The case is moving. Hayes says he expects to have grounds for formal charges by February." He set the soup pail down and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was beyond shared satisfaction in a legal process, something that was about her specifically, about seeing her face with something better on it than the controlled tension he had first met. "Mabel," he said. She looked up at him. He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back with 3 years of held breath finally releasing, and the schoolroom was warm, and the prairie was cold outside the frosted window, and somewhere down the street Sunday was standing in her stall eating oats, and the world was very simply itself, not smaller than it had been but more focused, the way a lens focuses light into something that can actually warm you. When they separated, he did not let go of her face, and she did not lean away, and they looked at each other at close range with the particular seriousness that follows a thing you cannot take back and do not want to. "I have been planning to do that for 2 months," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew." "I have been wondering what was taking you so long," she said. He laughed, surprised into it, and she laughed too, and then she heard the sound of children arriving in the yard outside, and she straightened and smoothed her skirt, and he picked up the soup pail and left it on the corner of the desk and went back to the door. "Supper tonight," he said. "Supper tonight," she said. The winter proceeded in the way that winters in Kansas proceed, hard and bright and cold in the way that is uncompromising, but also magnificent on the days when the ice catches the light and the snow fields are unbroken. Mabel had not planned for a Kansas winter in terms of clothing, and Simon drove her to a general store in the next town over, a better-stocked one than Caldwell's, and she spent an hour and a half selecting a proper coat and winter boots and a pair of thick wool gloves with the focused practicality of someone who has learned not to underestimate weather. He stood in the store and answered questions when she asked them, and did not offer opinions she had not requested, and he paid for nothing without being asked, which was correct because she had not asked. And when she paid from her teaching wages, she felt the particular satisfaction of purchasing what she needed with money she had earned, which was a satisfaction she had always valued. Christmas came, and the school held a small celebration with the children performing a reading they had prepared, and Mabel stood at the back of the schoolroom watching them, and felt something she had not expected, a fullness in her chest that was not grief and not triumph, but something more like gratitude, the ordinary profound variety. Simon stood beside her at the back of the schoolroom, and at some point in the middle of the children's reading, he took her hand in his, very quietly, and they stood there in the warm schoolroom with the candles lit, and the children reading and the prairie dark and cold outside, and it was the finest Christmas she had remembered in a very long time. January brought Hayes's most significant letter yet. The federal charges had been formally filed against Harlan Cross. The charges included land fraud across multiple territories, intimidation of witnesses, and falsification of legal documents. Cross had been served in Caldwell, ironically, where he had come to meet with a potential buyer for one of his properties, and the federal marshal had served him the papers at the very hotel Mabel had stayed in on her first night in Caldwell, which had a satisfying circularity to it. Hayes wrote that Cross's attorney was expected to negotiate a settlement rather than go to full trial, given the weight of the evidence against him, and that the settlement would almost certainly include financial restitution to the families who had been defrauded, including the Ford estate. Mabel read this letter standing at the window of Mrs. Alvarez's sitting room in the late afternoon light, and she read it twice, and then she set it down and was still for a long moment. She had been carrying this weight for 3 years and 4 territories, and here it was, the beginning of its end, formal charges filed. The machine of federal justice finally engaged and moving in the right direction. She had done what she set out to do. The debt was being settled. She felt the weight shift again, more dramatically this time, like a pack horse finally reaching camp and having the load lifted, not all at once but piece by piece, the lifting itself a kind of pleasure after so long. She went to find Simon. He was at the sheriff's office, as he often was in the late afternoon, and she came in without knocking because she had been there often enough that it no longer felt like a formality requiring ceremony, and she set Hayes's letter on the desk in front of him without speaking and watched him read it. When he finished, he looked up at her with the real smile, the full one. "Formal charges," he said. "Formal charges," she said. He stood and came around the desk, and she went to meet him, and when he put his arms around her, she let herself be held in the way that she had not let herself be held in 3 years, because she had not had anyone to do it, and because she had been afraid that if she allowed it she would stop moving and she needed to keep moving. But she did not need to keep moving anymore, not in the same way, and the warmth and the solidity of him was real and present, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and breathed. "It is not over yet," she said, practical even now. "No," he agreed, his chin resting on her hair. "But it is more over than it has ever been." February passed in the way that significant months pass when you are waiting for something large, with a mixture of patience that costs something and a growing certainty that the waiting will prove worth it. Hayes wrote every 2 weeks, and each letter advanced the story. Cross's attorney, as predicted, had begun settlement negotiations. The figure being discussed was substantial. Mabel taught school and walked the prairie in the evenings with Simon and sat by Mrs. Alvarez's fire on cold nights reading while he worked through his deputy's paperwork at the other end of the table, and she found that this, the simple daily ordinariness of a life shared in proximity, was something she had not known she missed so specifically until she was living it. She had a conversation with him in late February, sitting by that fire with snow coming down outside the window, about the land in Laredo. "The restitution money, if it comes through as Hayes expects," she said, "is not nothing. It would not buy back the exact property. Cross has developed parts of it, and the original land would likely be sold by the time the settlement is finalized. But it would be enough to start with." He looked at her over the top of his own papers. "Start what?" he said. She met his eyes. They were at the stage now where a question like that was not a small question, where both of them understood that the answer would mean something beyond itself. "I am 30 years old," she said. "I have spent 3 years in motion. I would like to stop moving eventually. Not stop entirely, I am not built for that, but stop the particular kind of moving I have been doing. I would like a place, not necessarily Laredo, but somewhere." "Somewhere," he said. "There is good land in Kansas," she said. "I have been looking at it all winter. The prairie is extraordinary, and there is still homestead land to be had if you are willing to work it, and I am more than willing to work." "A farm," he said. "Cattle more likely," she said. "I know cattle country better than grain. My father ran cattle. I know how it works." He was very quiet for a moment. "Mabel," he said. "Simon," she said. "I would like to be part of that," he said. "The somewhere, if that is something you are interested in." She looked at him with the directness that had been her habit since Caldwell. "You are a deputy in a fading town," she said, not unkindly. "Is that what you want to remain?" "No," he said, with the decisiveness of someone who had already had this thought privately. "I want land. I am good with cattle. I have been saving on a deputy's salary for 2 years, which is not a great sum, but it is something." He paused. "And if there is a federal settlement coming that includes restitution to the Ford estate, then there may be capital enough between us to do something real. Between us." She heard the phrase and noted it and let it sit in the room without picking it up immediately. "You are proposing a joint venture," she said. "I am proposing several things," he said carefully, and a joint venture is perhaps the least of them, but it is a reasonable place to start if you prefer to start there. She looked at him in the firelight for a long moment. "What is the most of them?" she said. He got up from his chair and came across to the sofa where she was sitting and sat down beside her, close but not touching, and looked at her with the quiet, steady attention that she had understood by now was his particular form of tenderness. "I am 32 years old," he said. "I have been watching you for 6 months, and I have decided that I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you, which is a thing I have never been moved to say about anyone." He paused. "I know that you have been independent for a long time, and that independence is not negotiable for you, and I want you to know that I am not proposing anything that would require you to be anything other than what you are, because what you are is what I am in love with." Another pause. "That is the most of them." The fire crackled. Outside, the snow was coming down steadily on Caldwell, Kansas, on the prairie, and the schoolhouse, and the livery where Sunday stood warm in her stall. "Simon Bancroft," Mabel said. "Yes," he said. "I am not practiced at this," she said, as she had told him once before. "I know," he said. "I am also not particularly practiced. We can be unpracticed together." She took his hand and turned it over and looked at it for a moment, the long, capable fingers, the calluses from rope and rain and hard work, and then she looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "to all of it, the somewhere and the joint venture and the most of them." He kissed her then with the same quiet certainty he applied to everything, and Mrs. Alvarez, who had absolutely been listening from the kitchen doorway, retreated with enormous satisfaction to put the kettle on, because some things were worth celebrating with proper tea. They were married in May, in the small Caldwell church that doubled as a community hall, on a morning when the prairie was at its finest, the wildflowers coming up through the new grass and the sky a precise cloudless blue, and the air carrying the smell of everything green and growing. Mrs. Alvarez made the wedding supper. The schoolchildren, led by Rosa and Eli, brought wildflower bouquets. Douglas Whitfield, the school board chairman, attended with his wife and had the slightly stunned expression of a man who has been present at something better than he expected. The sheriff, Alton Burke, did not attend, which no one mourned. Garrett Hayes sent a telegram of congratulations and news. The settlement with Harlan Cross had been finalized. Cross had agreed to pay restitution to 11 parties across 4 territories rather than face a full federal trial and the certain conviction that would follow. The Ford estate restitution was the largest single payment in the settlement, owing to the original value of the land and the length of time Cross had held it fraudulently. It was not enough to undo 3 years of grief, but it was enough to begin something new, genuinely and solidly. Mabel read Hayes's telegram on the morning of her wedding, standing in Mrs. Alvarez's kitchen in her good dress, her dark hair pinned up for the occasion, and she read it through once, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the small lacquered box she had carried with her for 3 years, the one that held her father's deed, the original document that had started everything. She put the box in her saddlebag, which would go on Sunday's saddle, because some things you carried forward even when the weight of them had changed. She married Simon Bancroft at 10 o'clock in the morning, and when the minister said the words she heard them clearly, all of them, and meant all of them with the full weight of a woman who did not say things she did not mean. Simon took her hand at the altar and looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his most honest, the expression he reserved for things that mattered, and she held his gaze and felt the particular solidity of a decision that is right in the way that truth is right, not because it is easy or comfortable, but because it is accurate. They had a small supper, and there was music from a fiddle player named Jorge Alvarez, Mrs. Alvarez's nephew, who played with a cheerful competence that got most of the guests dancing on the church's swept wooden floor, and Mabel danced with Simon, and it turned out he was a better dancer than she had expected, and she told him so. "My mother taught all 4 of her sons," he said, turning her neatly, "on the grounds that a man who cannot dance is a man who will spend half his life standing against walls looking foolish." "Your mother sounds excellent," she said. "She was," he said. "She would have liked you enormously." "How do you know?" she said. "Because you read books and you speak your mind and you handle horses with respect," he said. Those were her 3 criteria for worthwhile people. She laughed against his shoulder, and he held her a little closer, and the fiddle played on, and the spring evening was long and warm and full of the smell of prairie wildflowers through the open church door. By late summer they had their land. 160 acres northeast of Caldwell, claimed under the Homestead Act, flat good grazing land with a creek cutting through the north corner that ran reliably even in dry months, and a rise of ground at the eastern edge that would be a reasonable place to build. Simon had left the deputy position, formally and with the good wishes of the town, though not of Sheriff Burke, who had never quite forgiven either of them for the cross investigation, and who was in any case being watched carefully by his own superiors in the aftermath of it. They had pooled the settlement money and Simon's savings and Mabel's teaching wages, and they had exactly enough to begin, which was what beginning required. They built the house themselves, with help from neighbors, because that was how houses got built in Kansas in 1882, everyone who could swing a hammer showing up for a week, and the whole community raising something that would stand for generations. Mrs. Alvarez came and directed the kitchen arrangements with the authority of a general. Douglas Whitfield brought lumber from his brother-in-law's mill at cost. Jorge Alvarez brought his tools and his cheerfulness. Rosa's father came with 2 of his brothers and put up the strongest section of the east wall, and Rosa herself came and made Mabel a wildflower garland for the doorframe when it was hung, which Mabel pressed and kept. It was a small house, solidly built, with a kitchen large enough to work in, and a sitting room and 2 bedrooms, and a proper porch on the south side facing the best of the afternoon sun and the prairie view, which was the view Mabel had decided she could look at for the rest of her life without growing tired of it. They bought cattle, a starter herd of 30 head, from a rancher 2 counties over who was selling out to retire good solid animals at a fair price. Simon knew cattle and Mabel knew cattle, and together they knew them well enough to begin making decisions that would either prove good or educate them thoroughly, which was the only way to learn ranching. The fall was hard work and good work. They were up before dawn most days and often working until dark, the particular full exhaustion of building something from the ground up that leaves you too tired to be unhappy and just tired enough to sleep. They ate well because Mabel had inherited enough of her mother's kitchen sense to make good food quickly, and Simon had grown up in a household where everyone cooked because a household of 6, where only one person cooked, was a household where that one person never slept. And so they fed each other with the easy practicality of 2 people who consider feeding someone a reasonable form of care. They had disputes because they were both strong-willed and clear in their opinions, and the disputes were mostly about practical things, where to position the second water trough, whether the fencing on the south pasture needed reinforcing before winter, how best to handle a particular difficult steer who had ideas about his own grazing preferences that differed from theirs. The disputes were settled the way they settled everything, with discussion that went on until one of them had a better argument, or until they found a third option that neither had considered initially. She told him once after a particularly lengthy discussion about the fencing that ended with them both acknowledging that the other had a valid point, that she had been afraid this would be the hard part. "What the fencing?" he said. "The living together of it," she said. "The daily friction. I have been alone or moving for so long that I was afraid I had lost the capacity for compromise." He looked at her with the level attention that was his way. "You have not," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the point I am arriving at. It helps," he said, "that you are not afraid to say when you are wrong." "Neither are you," she said. "My mother again," he said. She insisted on it as a matter of basic honesty. "I like your mother more the longer I know you," she said. In the spring of 1883, Mabel realized she was expecting a child. She came to this knowledge with the particular combination of certainty and wonder that belongs to that specific discovery, the sense that the world has just quietly become more complex and more astonishing simultaneously. She told Simon on a Tuesday evening in April, sitting on the south porch with the last of the day's light going gold over the prairie, in the direct manner that was her way with everything that mattered. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was truly feeling something rather than performing a response. Then he took her hand and held it and looked at her with the expression she had by now classified as the deepest of his honest ones, the one that he showed her in the moments that were too large for words to carry alone. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said, "the same as I always am." "Good," he said, and then, after another moment, "Good." She laughed at the repetition. "You can say more than that," she said. "I am trying to find the right words," he said, which was as honest as everything else about him. "What I feel about this is larger than the words I am finding. I will need a moment." She leaned against his shoulder and they sat on the porch while the sky went from gold to rose to the deep blue of full evening, and the first stars came out over the Kansas prairie, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and Sunday stood in the small barn they had built, eating her oats, and the world was large and full and real. The boy was born in November, a gray cold morning that became warm inside the house with the fireplace going and Mrs. Alvarez in attendance along with the doctor who came out from Caldwell, a serious young man named Fielding who was competent and quiet, and who delivered the child with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to understand that the best thing he could do was stay out of the way and be useful. He was a healthy boy with dark hair and the kind of lungs that demonstrated no uncertainty about their presence in the world. Mabel held him and looked at him with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered, and she felt something settle in her that was entirely new, a layer of being that had not existed before, and which was not the same as anything she had felt before, though it was related to all of the love she had accumulated, for her father and for the land, and for the man sitting beside her on the edge of the bed with his hand on her back. "Thomas," she said. She had decided this early, though she had said nothing. Thomas had been her father's name. Simon looked at her, and his eyes were wet in the way that strong men's eyes are wet in the moments they have not prepared for, and she loved him for it. "Thomas," he agreed. Mrs. Alvarez, from somewhere near the fireplace, made a sound of profound approval. Thomas Ford Bancroft was 3 weeks old when Hayes's final letter arrived, a formal and thorough document detailing the full conclusion of the case against Harlan Cross. Cross had paid the settlement in full. The federal hold had been lifted. The Ford estate restitution had been transferred to Mabel's account at the bank in Wichita. The case was officially closed. Harlan Cross had relocated to the east, Hayes wrote, where he was someone else's problem in circumstances that did not involve land fraud, having been sufficiently and comprehensively warned about what federal attention felt like when it was fully engaged. His operation in Kansas had been dissolved. The land he had operated north of Caldwell had been redistributed. 2 of the families he had displaced in earlier territories had already filed to claim parcels of it. Mabel read this letter sitting in the armchair by the fire with Thomas asleep in the crook of her left arm, his small face turned against her shoulder, his breathing the slow, satisfied breathing of a person who has everything he requires. Simon read it over her shoulder and she felt him breathe. The debt was settled. 3 years and 4 territories and 1 more and it was settled, fully and completely, and in writing by the federal government of the United States of America. And her father's name was cleared, and his estate was acknowledged, and the wrong done to him was on record and acknowledged and punished. She held her son and she let herself feel all of it, the grief and the satisfaction and the relief and the gratitude and the love, all of it at once in the warm fire-lit room on the Kansas prairie, and she did not try to manage it or subdivide it or control it into something smaller. She just let it be the full size that it was. Simon came around the chair and crouched beside it and looked at her, and Thomas both with the expression that was his deepest honest one. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she said. He kissed her forehead, and then Thomas's forehead with equal gentleness, and then he went to the window and looked out at the November prairie for a moment with his hands in his pockets. And she let him have that moment, because some things needed to be stood with for a second before you could turn back toward ordinary life. She wrote to Hayes that afternoon, a proper letter of thanks that was also a record, setting down what the process had meant and what it had accomplished and what her father had been, because the record should include that, the person behind the case, the man who had worked 240 acres for 20 years with full faith in the promise of the land, and who had deserved to keep it. She wrote to the 11 people whose affidavits had built the case, brief letters of thanks and notification, because they had trusted her with their stories, and they deserved to know that the trust had been worth placing. She went out to the barn in the late afternoon and stood with Sunday for a while, her hand on the mare's warm neck, the animal turning to look at her with the dark, patient eye that horses turn on people they have decided to trust. Sunday had carried her across 4 territories and had done it with the steadiness and endurance that good horses give when they understand they are needed. She had earned her oats and her barn and her Kansas pasture. "Good girl," Mabel said, and meant it fully. The years that followed built themselves the way good years build, one season at a time, each one adding something to the previous one rather than erasing it. The cattle herd grew, carefully and deliberately, as they expanded the pasture and improved the breeding stock and made the decisions that turned a starter operation into something solid and self-sustaining. Simon proved, as she had suspected from the beginning, to be exactly the kind of man he appeared to be, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. He was steady and fair and funny in the dry, quiet way that takes you by surprise, and he worked beside her as an equal in everything that they built together, and deferred to her knowledge when hers exceeded his, and expected the same in return. She taught at the Caldwell School for 3 more years before Thomas's arrival made the daily ride into town impractical, and then she organized, with the help of Rose's family and 2 other families from the neighboring farms, a small informal school at the farmhouse 2 mornings a week for the children of the surrounding area who were too far from town for daily schooling. It was not a formal arrangement, but it was a real one, and it served the children it served, including eventually Thomas himself, who was from a very early age intensely interested in everything and required fairly constant mental engagement to remain manageable. A daughter came when Thomas was 4, born in the spring when the wildflowers were up, and the prairie was at its most extravagant, and they named her Clara, which had been Simon's mother's name, a decision he proposed with the careful tentativeness of a man who is not certain if proposing a name from his family to a woman who has carried the weight of her own family is the right thing to do, and Mabel said yes immediately, and he understood that she meant it, and that the yes was also a kind of welcome. Welcoming his family into the space they were building together. Clara was as different from Thomas as 2 children raised by the same parents in the same house can be. Thomas was deliberate and focused, interested in the mechanics of everything, how things worked and why, always taking something apart to see what was inside it. Clara was expansive and social, and had an opinion about everything from the age of 2, and a voice she was entirely unafraid to use in support of those opinions, which was something that Mabel watched with a complicated mixture of parental concern for the practicalities this would cause the child and profound satisfaction in what it said about who the child was. She told Simon once, watching Clara at the age of 3 conduct a serious and lengthy argument with the rooster about access to the feeding area, that she recognized that quality. "I wonder where she gets it," Simon said. "From her grandfather," Mabel said, which was true, and also the kind of thing that made her heart full in the way that grief, when it has been properly honored, eventually transforms into. The farmhouse grew, a room added on the east side when Thomas outgrew sharing with Clara, and then a proper summer kitchen that Mabel had wanted from the beginning, and that was finally practical to build once the cattle operation was generating the income to support it. The south porch became her favorite place to end the day, with the prairie view and the evening light, and she was rarely on it alone because Simon had the same habit and Thomas had picked it up, and Clara, once she was old enough to sit still for more than 30 seconds, discovered that the porch in the evening was where the interesting conversations happened, and began attending with the focused attention of someone who does not intend to miss anything. In 1889, Kansas became a full state, which had been coming for years, but which, when it arrived, felt like a formal acknowledgement of something that had been true on the ground for a long time. Simon read the announcement from the Wichita newspaper aloud at the supper table, and Thomas, who was 6, asked a series of precise and excellent questions about what statehood meant and what changed and what stayed the same, and they spent the whole supper answering them to his satisfaction. Mabel wrote in her journal that night, a habit she had taken up 3 years prior, not to document events but to set down the quality of things, the texture of particular days and what they had meant. She wrote about statehood and about Kansas, about what it had been when she rode into it 4 territories into her reckoning and what it had become, and she wrote about her father, as she often did, and about what he would have made of all of it. She thought he would have been glad. She thought he would have stood on this south porch in the Kansas evening and looked at the prairie and recognized it as the same promise that had brought him to Texas 40 years before, the promise of land and work and the possibility of building something that would outlast you. She thought he would have liked Simon. She thought he would have been outrageous with Thomas and Clara in the way that grandfathers are outrageous, free of the responsibilities of parenthood, and therefore able to be purely delightful. She missed him with a love that had become, finally, more warm than aching, the way loss eventually becomes if you live with it honestly and do not try to make it into something smaller than it is. She closed the journal and went out to the porch where Simon was sitting in the evening air looking at the stars, and she sat beside him and he put his arm around her, and she put her head on his shoulder, and they sat with the enormous Kansas sky above them, and the prairie quiet around them, and the house warm behind them where their children were sleeping. "Do you think about it," she said, "where we each might have ended up if I had ridden through a different town?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was genuinely considering. "Caldwell was not exactly a destination for me," he said. "I was there because it was the right size of town for a deputy at that point in my life, and because I had no particular reason to be anywhere else. I might have moved on within the year. And I would have ridden into Wichita alone," she said, "and hoped Hayes was accessible and receptive." "He would have been," Simon said. "The case was solid." "Yes," she said, "but it would have been different." He pulled her slightly closer, and she felt the familiar warmth of him, the quality she had understood from nearly the beginning, the solidity that was not stubbornness but steadiness, the kind that does not move when the wind is bad. "I am glad you rode into Caldwell," he said. "I am glad you said you would ride the 5th Territory with me," she said. He kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made," he said. She looked up at the stars, the Kansas stars that were extraordinary in their quantity and brightness on a clear night, the kind of sky that you only saw in open country where nothing was tall enough to interrupt the view in any direction. She thought about the 4 territories, Texas and Indian Territory and Colorado and Kansas. She thought about Sunday's hooves on 4 different kinds of ground and the weight of the saddlebag, and the sealed envelope with 3 years of evidence in it, and the 30-second allowance she had given herself for tiredness every morning before getting back on the horse. She thought about walking into a sheriff's office in a fading cattle town and finding a man at a desk with his feet up, reading a land survey report, who had looked at her with the particular attention that meant he was actually listening. She thought about the debt and the settling of it and about what came after settling, which was not emptiness as she had sometimes feared but fullness, the kind of full life that comes from having chosen it with your whole self. Thomas and Clara were asleep inside. Sunday was in the barn. The prairie ran to the horizon in every direction, and beyond it the country kept going, enormous and various and real. The same country that had tried to stop her at every border and had failed because she was not a woman who could be stopped by territory. And the same country that had given her, in a town called Caldwell in the territory of Kansas, a deputy with wolf-quiet eyes who had looked at the problem and identified the most efficient solution and offered to ride the fifth with her. She reached over and found his hand in the dark and held it, and he held hers back. And they sat in the good silence of people who have said what needed saying and built what needed building, and who have the particular peace of those who have carried something hard all the way to its end, and found that what waited at the end was worth every mile of the carrying. The prairie was quiet and the stars were brilliant, and the evening was cool and sweet, and Kansas in the summer is, as anyone will tell you who has seen it properly, one of the most beautiful places in the world. Mabel Ford Bancroft, who had ridden across 4 territories on a debt and a promise and a determination that nothing in any of those territories had been able to break, sat on her south porch with her husband's hand in hers and looked at the sky that was also hers, this sky above this land that she had chosen and built and planted herself into. And she was 33 years old and she was home. Not the home she had started from, the 240 acres in Laredo that were gone and which no settlement could replace exactly, but the home she had made, which is always the home that matters most, the one you find at the end of a long ride when you have finally gone far enough in the right direction. She thought of her father and smiled. He would have liked this porch. He would have liked this view. He would have liked the way the grass moved in the evening wind, the way it always moved in Kansas, endlessly and beautifully, like something breathing. And she thought, holding Simon's hand and watching the stars come fully out over the prairie, that the debt was settled and the land was tended and the children were sleeping and the man beside her was exactly who he had always appeared to be, and that she was, in all of the ways that genuinely counted, exactly where she was supposed to be. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything. The stars kept coming out, one by one and then in their multitudes, the way they always did in Kansas when the sky was clear and the land was flat and there was nothing in any direction to interrupt the view. And the two of them sat with the dark and the stars and the good silence and the quiet sound of the prairie breathing around them, and the world was full and real and theirs.